This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to The Agenda. I'm Stephen Cole. Let's talk about debt. Now, money might make the world go around, but borrowing has reached its highest level on record. Now, this week on The Agenda, we're going to talk about whether global debt is really a sword of Damocles, a burden hanging over us all, or if it's actually become an essential part of our everyday lives. We are speaking to a global sovereign debt lawyer who's spent 40 years helping governments mend their finances. Hey Big Spender, we discuss whether we should eradicate household debt and speak to someone whose strict saving methods paid off. And from bad debt to a good deed, why countries struggling to save their economy could instead be saving the planet. There's not enough money in the world to pay off our total global debt. According to the Institute of International Finance, total world debt is expected to reach $255 trillion by next month. And to put that into some kind of context, that's more than 1 million times the cost of China's Bird's Nest Olympic Stadium, or 100,000 times greater than the value of Buckingham Palace in London, which is currently valued at $2 billion. If the debt was equally shared by each of the 7.7 billion people on the planet, each of us would owe $32,000. America is sometimes referred to as being owned by China due to the substantial debt between the two countries. In southern Europe, the euro debt problem spiraled into serious crises for the European Central Bank. Greece, Italy, Spain, Ireland and Portugal are all massively overloaded with debt. In the UK, more than 1 million households are said to be in extreme problem debt. Despite that, London's Institute for Fiscal Studies predicts the next UK government will nevertheless break rules on spending. If we wanted to pay back the total debt owed around the world, one of us would need to donate $1 every second for more than 7 million years. And of course, that isn't a sensible or a feasible answer. But with 60 countries now in financial distress, a more sensible answer does need to be found, and found urgently. Now, the spotlight is invariably on America when it comes to global debt. There isn't a big enough mattress in the world to hide it all under. CGTN's John Terrett is in the Big Apple, and he's going to explain the significance of US debt.
In New York's Midtown Manhattan, you can actually see the US national debt rising higher than even the iconic Empire State Building. 6th Avenue and 43rd Street is home to the National Debt Clock, part tourist attraction, part ominous sign of just how much debt the United States is in and how fast it's going up. The National Debt Clock is a billboard-sized running total showing the current gross national debt and each American family's share of it. There's even an online version, so you can follow along at home if you want to. The total just hit a whopping $23 trillion, according to data from the United States Treasury. Now today, the debt clock is registering $22,343,425,000,000, and the average family in the United States, their share of the debt, more than $900,000 each family. It seems this national debt clock has a bit of catching up to do. Still, 22 trillion, 23 trillion, it's an awful lot of money. Growing budget deficits have boosted the nation's debt by around 16% since Trump's inauguration in January 2017, when it was around 19 trillion. Which is odd when you remember the Republican mantra is usually a balanced budget, tax cuts to stimulate growth, and smaller government, all designed to trim the national debt so it's less of a burden for the kids when they grow up. Congress looks the other way because the dollar is the king of currencies. Everyone's happy to take one off you wherever you are in the world, and dollars are only printed by the US Treasury. You've heard the term, printing money. Somewhere between 4 to 6 trillion of US national debt is held in Treasury bills, notes and bonds held by foreign countries, of which China holds around 1.1 trillion. That's between 20 and 30%, depending on your calculation. Back at 6th and 43rd, the numbers are still heading up rather fast. Ironically, the billionaire real estate family that keeps the clock going has had it, with President Trump's policies adding to the national debt. It was showing a national debt of just $3 trillion when this clock first went up in Midtown Manhattan. The family is reported as saying the best way to get this number down dramatically now is to tax the rich more. John Terrett, CGTN, New York.
And thanks to John for that special report for the agenda. And that is the situation in America. But what about the rest of the world? I spoke to TOBIAS ADRIAN, who wrote the International Monetary Fund's latest Global Financial Stability Report, and asked him what they're most worried about.
What we're highlighting in the latest report is that interest rates are low. They have fallen this year, and they're expected to stay low for a long time. That is triggering reactions by market participants, and they're going into riskier assets in order to generate yield. At the same time, leverage is rising, debt is rising in the corporate sector in many countries around the world, and among sovereigns as well. So as investors are reaching for yield, there's more issuance of debt, and the question is, where are we going to end up?
And my question is, where are we going to end up?
Absolutely. So as long as interest rates are going to stay very low for very long, a higher level of debt of sovereigns, so nations, and corporates is probably sustainable. But the risk is that interest rates are going to rise at some point, that risk premia such as credit spreads are going to widen, and at that point, the high level of debt might be unsustainable.
How much of a risk is this continuing policy of low interest rates around the world, which I'm sure you'll agree encourages people to lend and to borrow?
It is an intended consequence of easy monetary policy to get the real economy to invest more. The problem is it comes with a side effect of more risk. And our advice is to mitigate the degree to which debt is rising in order to mitigate those unintended consequences of easier monetary policy.
Is it likely anybody is going to listen to your advice?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. We have the ears of the central bank governors and the finance ministers from around the world, and they understand these trade-offs. So as a policymaker, you always face trade-offs, and considering the trade-offs carefully is what we urge policymakers to do.
Is there anything in place to discourage countries from borrowing even more? And I'm thinking about the Argentinas, the Venezuelas.
In the banking sector, there are very effective limits on how much banks can borrow. And this was one of the good consequences of the financial crisis, is that there was a regulatory reform agenda that put a limit onto how much banks can borrow. So the banking system is a lot safer today than it was 10 or 15 years ago. Now, in terms of the corporate sector, we don't have these types of prudential standards like capital ratios or liquidity ratios. And so there isn't as much of a limit on the corporates. And then thirdly, what you're mentioning is on the sovereigns. On the sovereigns, it's really the political process that is the constraint. And in some countries, the political process works and is putting a constraint on the amount of debt that countries are taking on, but that's not true everywhere.
China holds a huge amount of American debt. Does that automatically give China leverage over America?
The Chinese central bank, called the PBOC, is holding reserves in US dollar assets, primarily in US treasuries. And this is not unlike many central banks around the world. The US dollar is a reserve asset, and many central banks hold large amounts of US treasuries as reserves. That in and of itself doesn't provide any power of the PBOC over over American politics or anything like that. It is really a reserve asset that is used as a buffer in crisis situations.
Tobias, many thanks to you for joining us here on The Agenda. Lee Buchheit is a veteran lawyer who has served more than 4 decades on the sovereign debt front line and joins me now in the Agenda studio. Lee Buchheit, what exactly does the IMF do? And does it do it well?
Okay. It performs a series of functions. Every year, the IMF conducts what they call surveillance of each member country. They send a team of economists to the country. They assess the country's fiscal and monetary policies, and they offer advice. When a country gets into trouble, their role expands considerably. The IMF will offer financial assistance to the country, but never without strings attached. And those strings take the form of prescriptions for fiscal adjustment, and typically the financial assistance is conditioned upon the country meeting certain prescribed targets. That involvement by the IMF then becomes crucial as the country's other creditors, their government creditors and their commercial creditors, assess whether the country is reforming its economy and stands some chance of repaying the debt on its new terms. And all of that falls on the shoulders of the IMF.
When a country gets into serious trouble, it invariably goes bankrupt. You've represented just about every single country that's gone bankrupt, so that when you land at the airport in that country, is that when they start worrying?
No, they will have started worrying long before that. By the time they get around to calling someone like me, it is clear that they have run out of more palatable options.
Do you have to sometimes return to the country a second time?
Oh,
Do
yeah.
they learn from their mistakes?
You mean, do countries go through debt restructurings multiple times? Yes, I'm afraid they do. Argentina, as you see at the moment, is on the verge of yet another one, having only emerged from the last one 4 years ago.
And the IMF lent them 50 billion.
Well, I think they have now an exposure of 44 billion. Yes, they did. That I think is the largest program the IMF has ever implemented.
Venezuela?
Venezuela is a difficult case, and I'm acting as strategic advisor to the Guaido administration in Venezuela. Venezuela has about 155 billion of external debt. Most of it is in default. But the debt restructuring for that country cannot begin until Nicolas Maduro, the current president, at least as he sees it, leaves. But he has proven to be far more adhesive than any of us thought he would be.
In Europe, we know about the financial problems, especially in southern Europe,
Yeah.
in Portugal, in Greece, in Italy. They have borrowed hugely from the ECB and other sources. Can they ever reasonably or feasibly expect to pay off those debts?
I think you have to analyze that country by country. Greece, which has borrowed the most and which has the highest so-called debt to gross domestic product ratio. Greece has benefited because those official creditors have stretched out those loans for a very long period of time and given Greece the benefit of a very low interest rate. But it is a staggering debt stock.
So you're basically saying they won't ever pay off those debts?
Well, I suspect at some point in the future, when memories have faded and politicians have left the stage, there will be, people will revisit those debt stocks.
When you say revisit, I mean, will they write them off?
Some of it, I suspect, yes. Not, I think, without conditions. They will write it off if the debtor country implements certain economic fiscal policies, in effect earns the debt relief.
Do low interest rates encourage countries like people to go into debt?
Undoubtedly. We We are now 10 years into, since the financial crisis, a period in which the central banks, major central banks, have driven interest rates to zero or near zero. Moreover, they have attempted monetary stimulus by pumping enormous quantities of liquidity into the market, which from the standpoint of the investor community means that there's an awful lot of money that needs to find a home. That benefits sovereign debtors, but in both developing and developed countries. And they have been able to borrow large amounts of money at interest rates that no sober historian of the sovereign debt history would say is remotely commensurate with the real risk.
Have you ever come across countries where the chancellor or the leader of the chief accountant of a country has decided we just can't borrow anymore? In fact, they stop borrowing because they want to be fiscally correct. Or do countries just continue to borrow?
No, it occasionally happens. These exercises are so painful for the country. Remember, a sovereign debt crisis never comes in isolation. There's almost always a banking crisis and a trade crisis, a currency crisis, often a social crisis. They are hugely disruptive for the debtor country. Occasionally, you will have a group of politicians who will say never again. Unfortunately, memories fade, politicians change, and the political imperative, not imperative, the political temptation to balance a budget, not by raising taxes or by cutting expenditures, but rather by borrowing the difference, the budget deficit, that temptation is almost irresistible to the political flesh.
Lee Buchheit, many thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Stephen.
And still to come on the agenda, why countries in the red are going green, and how a mother of three and a debt-ridden accountant flipped her finances to clear her debt.
I don't have any credit card debt now, but I've still got the ability to get £30,000, £40,000 worth of credit.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
CGTN Europe.
And welcome back to The Agenda. I'm Stephen Cole. We've been talking about the difficult side of debt, but did you know there's a scheme that allows developing countries to transform their debt into conservation promises? It started by the World Wildlife Fund in 1984. Debt for Nature swaps aim to reduce the excessive debt faced by the world's poorest countries through conservation projects. Many developing countries are rich in natural resources, from rainforests, seas to coral reefs, but often they don't have the funds to support large environmental projects. And this is where the organisations like the WWF come in. They offer to resolve a portion of a country's debt on the condition the government commits the funds to conservation efforts. So far, the WWF's programme alone has generated more than $1 billion for conservation projects, all over the world. Perhaps magic money trees do exist after all. Now, personal debt in the UK is higher than ever at around £217 billion, and that's almost $280 billion. Banks in debt often get bailed out, but who's saving us from high-cost lenders and that vicious cycle of credit? Joining me now is LYNN James, founder of Mrs Mummypenny, who broke free from her debt and is now helping others do just that. And also with us is Dr. JOHNNA Montgomerie from King's College London, author of Should We Abolish Household Debt? But I want to start with you, Lynn, first. A degree in mathematics?
Yes.
An accountant?
Yeah.
And you still went into debt to the tune of, what, £16,000 over, what, almost $30,000?
Yeah. So it was a change of circumstance which arrived at that debt, which I think is something that's a common situation for a lot of people. I decided to set up my own business, and I used to work in the city for a telco company as an accountant, and I didn't adjust my life as quickly as I should have done. So I was living off of redundancy money that ran out quicker than I thought. I was spending the same way as I did when I earned more money, and then I built up some debt.
So the key advice is, if you're spending more than you're earning, then you're going to get into trouble.
Yeah. And it was an element of keeping up with the Joneses, going on certain holidays, buying certain clothes, because I was still in this mould of when I was working that employed life. So I didn't change my money mindset quickly enough.
Okay, let's go to JOHNNA. You've written a book called Should We Abolish Household Debts?
This book is about looking at the bigger picture, the bigger macroeconomic picture that debt is causing. Because if debt is a personal problem, it's one shared by an ever-growing portion of society. And that means that it's not just down to personal choice. There are bigger issues at play. So we hear this example of the number one reason in the UK that people get into problem debt is because of an unforeseen event. So you are made redundant, your hours are cut, a family member is made ill and are unable to work. These events, we used to have a safety net to allow people to have that cushion until they get back on their feet.
What was that safety net?
So that safety net would have been unemployment benefit for when you're made redundant. You would be allowed to have benefit if you were made ill and unable to work. But now,
and a limited overdraft, perhaps?
Yeah, exactly. And also there would be sort of support for families in terms of, again, when a family member is ill, that it's not just, oh, well, if you can't work today, you won't be paid. So these things have been slowly eroded as the cost of living is going up. And what we find is that more and more people are getting into debt, not only because they've chose to buy things they can't afford, but they've had to go into debt out of necessity. So here we think about young people who took out student loans to get an education, then go into the job market, are precarious laborers, and then are made unemployed. They've built up this debt in good faith to get a start at a future that others were offered and given opportunity without debt. And then we say, well, it's a personal problem. It is slightly a personal problem, but there are also much bigger economic issues at play here. And we need to start thinking in this book about debt abolition as a way of reviving the economy and allowing it to grow in a more sustainable way than this kind of boom-bust bailout cycle that we're currently in and really just on the verge of repeating again.
Yeah. Lynn, I mean, basically, you got into debt because it was your fault. You spent too much.
I spent too much. And
we're not talking about a student getting into debt because
No.
of student fees and everything else they have to spend. But yours was, I saw a credit card, I saw something I wanted, and I bought it.
And the credit was so easily accessible. Like even now, when I'm in this position of, I don't have any credit card debt now, but I've still got the ability to get £40,000 worth of credit.
JOHNNA, the advice people will always give you, say, well, why don't you live within your means? Is that helpful or is that unhelpful?
Well, I think it's more the kind of contradiction that we face when we live in such a large economy. I mean, Britain's one of the largest economies in the world. The truth is that everybody should follow this advice. You should absolutely get a budget, and you should most certainly never spend beyond the limits of your income if you don't want to get into problem debt. But the reality is that if everybody followed this advice from Black Friday or over the Christmas period, the entire UK economy will be in a recession in the new year, and we will all suffer as a result of this kind of, Keynes talked about this paradox of thrift. Thrift is a very good thing on an individual level, but on the level of an entire economy, it is actually can cause recession and deep depression if it's not thought about in a holistic way.
Young people get into debt. Does that mean they're living with debt nearly all their lives, so they get used to that, get used to having so much debt, and therefore is that a dangerous emotion to have?
Well, I think absolutely acclimatizing yourself to having, for example, the average they say is £14,000. This is almost a part-time income that people are accessing on average in order to kind of fund their lifestyle. And I do think if you get used to it, you'll never ask the question, wouldn't it be better if I earned £14,000 more a year versus stay where I am and just take out a loan? The personal debt levels have crept up in the UK precisely at the time when wages have stagnated. So we kind of know that that's a factor, but also at the same time as the social safety net has steadily eroded and the cost of housing has gone up and up and up. So they're connected, although people will have credit cards perhaps because their mortgage is very expensive, so they have to make ends meet. So they are connected even though they're different types of debt. And we see the level of debt, for example, in the UK, private debt is as high as public debt. So while people will bang on endlessly about, what about the future generation, what about our children with this big public debt, they don't want to talk about the private debt, but it's as big and as big a problem, yeah.
Lastly, Lynn, advice to young people or anybody in debt?
It's touching on what you said earlier on. I discovered debt when I was young, when I was 18, and it took me 20 years to get out of that cycle of it just felt like the norm to have that debt. So it's changing that mindset of really working hard to get out of that debt and getting to the position where, no, this isn't my money. This is money that I have to pay back, and changing your life and your budgets and living within your means. I hate to say that, but it is.
All right, this brings us back to the original point. Lynn James, many thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And Dr. JOHNNA Montgomerie, thank you very much for joining us here on The Agenda. In the build-up to the UK election, there's competition between the two main political parties over which one can bribe us most lavishly with our own money. Both main parties are promising to spend to persuade us to vote for them. They ignore the fact the UK is already in debt to the tune of almost £1,800 billion. Most voters, I think, are quite able to understand the difference between a government promise, a credit card, mortgage and debt, but others can't. And it's not exactly the most responsible political message to be sending to people already digging deep to afford a good Christmas. 1 million UK households are already having to use food banks, and their benefits are being cut to repay debts and loans. The Shakespearean quote of "neither a borrower nor a lender be" is a good rule of thumb, but politicians ahead of an election don't take much notice of it, and they don't seem to either when they reach or leave government. The former Labour Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Liam Byrne, left a note for his coalition successor saying there's no money left. Labour had spent the lot, and when you don't have the money, austerity has to follow, whether you're a person or a government. Debt can increase your buying power, but while the banks get richer, your earnings are going to be getting much thinner. And you might have that piece of jewellery or that new car or expensive holiday, but after the initial high comes years of paying back sometimes double what you borrowed. It's the debt trap, and it's one too many are falling into. Next week on The Agenda, the election question. Is there any such thing as a truly democratic electoral system? And are political opinion polls really worth the effort? We'll find out on The Agenda next week. Don't forget, for more of The Agenda's content, you can visit our website or you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, and all the Agenda team here in London, it's goodbye.